Flanagan. I'm the program manager of the Drinking Water for School grant program, and we have finished our reviews of all of the applications, and we received more applications that are applications for more funding than was available. So we fully committed the $9.5 million that was available, and now we have 76 projects. So we have 76 school districts, with some with multiple schools. About 2/3 of the money went to access improvements, and about 1/3 went to projects that are trying to address a water quality issue, just for your information. And we understand our grant agreement process can be a little confusing, so we're hoping this will help clarify some of the process and get everyone off to a good start.
Okay, gotcha.
And the presenters will be Ravi Jawanda, she's a grant manager, and Andrew Hoekstra, he is a program analyst. They both have a lot of experience with this. We are going to be answering questions at the end, but I understand some of you don't have access to the Skype. So if you do have access, feel free to enter a question at any time. If you don't have access, we will open up the line at the end for your questions. And I believe Ravi will start us off. Thank you, guys.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Ravi Jawanda, and I am one of the presenters today. So let's get started. So the next steps is the first slide for those that are following along on the PDF. Most of you should have received an email which notified that you have been approved, and the paperwork that we need, which is the standard 204 and the project director certification forms. Along with those forms, we also need a draft resolution. Hopefully most of you guys are finalizing your resolutions at this point. And then we eventually will need the board signed resolution, and this we will need before we execute any agreements with any of the districts. So moving to point number 2, you'll get the draft funding agreement and a chance to review and comment. We hope that you can review within 5 business days and submit your comments. And the folks that you'll be submitting your comments to are the project analyst and the grant manager that submit the email to you. Bullet number 3, funding agreement execution. So the agreement will be executed by the State Water Board with the districts. Once we finalize the agreement will be submitted to the district to sign and submit back to the State Water Board. And once the deputy director signs the agreement, we will have the executed, finalized agreement with the State Water Board and the district. Once we have a start date, which some of you folks may have at this point, you're allowed to submit invoices and incur costs. So we don't recommend incurring costs until you have executed a grant agreement with the State Water Board. But some of these projects and schools will have a backdated start date, and we will reimburse those costs that are directly related to our projects. And
okay, thanks.
Okay. So most of the progress reports and invoices will be submitted quarterly. You have to submit a $0 invoice if there is no work performed. each quarter we need an invoice. And then finally, the fifth bullet, which is the work completion date. This is when you will submit the final invoice by the work completion date. And this work completion date is referring to all the work that's in the grant agreement, not just the implementation of the fountains or the point of use filters, whatever your project is related to, but it's referring to all the work, so all the reports and things of that such that needs to be completed by the work completion date. Again, we will need the resolution prior to executing the grant agreement, so hopefully a lot of you schools are getting those finalized and submitting it to the program analyst. And then just to reiterate one more time, work completion date means no work will be reimbursed after this date. So you want to make sure that all work is completed before the work completion date. Moving on to the next slide. The roles of the GM, which is the grant manager, the PA, which is the program analyst, and PD, which is the project director. I will be explaining the roles of them. So the grant agreement is between the State Water Board and the grantee. And in this case, the grantee is all of you, the school district folks. So the State Water Board does not have agreement with third parties. So I know many of you will be hiring consultants and subcontractors that will be doing this work. Please make sure that the questions are coming through you to us, and that your consultants and subcontractors are not directly communicating with us. And this just helps with the line of communication. It does get confusing with 76 projects. Again, it's one main point of contact. So the project director form will list who is the project manager and the project director. Those are the two folks from the district that should be contacting the program analyst and the grant manager. Okay, moving on. So the grant manager roles, and again, I'm a grant manager, so this is some of the roles that I will be conducting. So I will, grantees, I am the grantee's main contact along with the program analyst. I will keep an audible file, so again, all districts should keep a file of this project. So I will review and approve invoices. I will review backup documentation for accuracy and eligibility, ensure costs are aligned with our budget, and I will submit disputes if any invoices are not organized correctly or unclear with what is being submitted. I will also review and approve the reports and the work that the work products, so any of the pilot plans, the schedule. I will be reviewing everything that's submitted and relevant to your project. And I will also monitor the progress with respect to the schedule, so I will try to make sure that we're staying on schedule and not falling behind. And I will assist with assuring that the project is completed and answer any of the project director or project manager questions that you guys might have throughout the life of this project. And again, it's not just me. We have multiple grant managers and program analysts, so that will be listed. I believe it's like page 4 of your agreement. So make sure you guys are contacting the correct grant manager and the correct program analyst.
So moving on to the next slide, the program analyst roles. Myself, I'm Andrew. I am one of the program analysts. Our roles are more related to the administrative sections of the grant. So we will also review and process your invoices up to accounting. We will update some tracking spreadsheets that you will be sent once your grant has been executed. We will ensure your reimbursement is not over 90% Towards the end of the grant, we are going to hold 10% in retention until everything is finalized. And that is a 10% that's held off at the end. We don't hold 10% of every invoice. The last bit is just to ensure that your project is completed to satisfaction is why we hold that last 10%. And then we're also going to prepare and process any amendments. For the most part, there's not going to be any time extensions for these grants because I believe most of you have a 2/28/2021 end date, and the money that was allotted to us is needs to be liquidated by the end of that fiscal year, so June 30th of 2021. So we won't be able to extend any of these grants past 2/28/2021. If you're one of the few grantees that has an end date before that, there may be some room for extensions, but that would be a one-off conversation you would need to have with your specific grant manager or analyst. In regards to the program analysts, we're also the main point of contact for invoicing questions. If you have any questions related to payment after you've submitted an invoice, you can direct those to the program analysts because we have the capability to log into the new statewide accounting system and check on the status of your invoices. At this time, I don't believe the grant managers have that capability. So if you have questions about invoicing, you can contact your program analyst. Normally, it's going to take 4 to 6 weeks once you submit an invoice to get paid anyway. So after a month or so, if you haven't heard back or received a check, that would be an okay time to contact the program analyst. Moving on to the next slide, the project director roles. And again, you on the line as the grantee have signified to us who the project director will be. Your roles are to maintain the schedule of the project, to stay in contact and have an open line of communication with the grant manager and program analysts. You're going to be submitting invoices and deliverables. The deliverables will be laid out in a submittal table. If you've received a draft agreement already, it's probably somewhere around page 11 or 12. You will also maintain a 7-year auditable file. That is a requirement of our grant that you need to keep either a hard copy, electronic copy, whatever it is that you're saving, you're going to need to keep for 7 years from the work completion date. And then, of course, you're also going to ensure the project is completed per the agreement. And I know that there was a question about subcontractors earlier. It is the responsibility of the project director and the grantees to be hiring subcontractors that are qualified to do the work that is laid out in the grant. As it comes to bidding and going out to bid, we leave that up to your board's decision. However it is that you guys are authorized to go out to bid, that's how you do it. We don't get in the way of that. And then also, some of you, if you have point of use grants for contamination issues, you're also going to want to stay in contact with what we call a technical contact, and that person is a regional board representative that will be laid out in your grant agreement, and they're responsible for usually Division of Drinking Water, DDW, and that person will be responsible for the monitoring of your POUs to say that, yes, you're below the contamination level, et cetera, and you can start using the POUs in the other areas besides the pilot testing. To move on to the next slide, we have some important due dates. Ravi mentioned earlier, a lot of you have back start dates. So maybe that's because you had a contamination issue and you're receiving bottled water already. So we can reimburse any project-related costs starting on your start date. We just can't start reimbursing you until there is an executed agreement signed by both parties. And I think a lot of you have an eligible start date of May 1st if you're access only. And again, that has something to do with how our money was allotted. So critical dates and estimated due dates are two dates you'll see in the submittal table. Estimated due dates are exactly as they read. They are estimated. So we usually just put a month and a year when we expect to have those deliverables. Critical dates are dates that need to be met or they can trigger a breach of agreement. So it's imperative that you look at the submittal table when you receive a draft agreement and make sure that all the dates, both in the estimated, but more importantly in the critical column, are realistic dates that you know you can meet. Work completion date, like Robbie mentioned, again, is the date that all of your work needs to be complete. If you have final reports, those need to be done by then. Your final invoicing will come in a month after that. And again, it's all the work. It's not just the finishing of the construction. It's any monitoring, reporting, et cetera, et cetera. So moving on to the next slide.
Okay, so invoice due dates. Invoices are due on the grant manager's desk 45 days following end of the quarter or monthly, can be earlier. So some folks are going to be on a monthly basis, but majority of the grantees will be on a quarterly invoice basis. So at each quarter, you'll be submitting a progress report and the invoice with the backup and the receipts. So your accounting department should already be working on the first invoice, even if no work will be performed the first quarter. So what we mean by this is that we should be having executed agreements shortly. And again, since it's quarterly, we follow the quarterly basis. So you would be preparing your first quarter invoice. Late invoices may trigger a breach of agreement. Please stay in contact with your grant manager and let them know if you're running behind or if you're going to have an invoice a little late. It's always better to communicate that with them than to leave them hanging. Again, and the last bullet, submit invoices and progress reports even if there's a $0 invoice. Since this is agreement with the state water boards, and if you have a $0 quarter where there was no work done related to the project, no admin work, nothing, you will then submit a $0 invoice, and we need that to process, even though it's a $0 invoice.
Moving on to the next slide, the invoice formatting, and there will be a slide coming up that shows you the actual invoice forms we're using, so don't worry about that just yet. The official formatting of the invoice will come to you guys either from the program analyst or our administrative assistant when you receive the executed grant agreement via email. And please do not mess with the formatting of either of the invoices. We will pre-fill out your names, addresses, budget, line item allotments, et cetera, et cetera. You will only need to fill in a handful of information, and the rest will either auto-populate with some calculations or will be pre-filled in already. And to reiterate the third bullet item, the grant managers won't accept any other invoice template other than the ones that we provide you. So it's imperative that you don't mess around with them. And as Robbie mentioned, I'd say about 90% of you are going to be on the quarterly system. And so we have a regular state quarter system. So we go January 1st to March 31st, which would make your invoices due May 15th or before, 45 days after March 31st. Then April 1st to June 30th, which would make your invoices due August 15th or before. July 1st to September 30th, which has an invoice due November 15th or earlier. and the last 3 months, October 1st to December 31st, and that would give you an invoice due date of February 15th or before. And again, the earlier the better, because it gives us more time to process, review, get back to you with any questions that we may have. Moving on to the next slide, the tail of the invoice. All of you obviously are going to submit an invoice, and then it should be mailed within 45 days of being approved. And you will know it is approved because you will receive an email from our disbursement group stating that invoice number X for Y dollars has been processed on such and such date. And then when you receive that email, you know you should be receiving a check within about 45 days. Again, the program analyst will be your main point of contact for invoicing. So if you haven't received a payment in, I would say, 60 days, that's definitely a sign for you to call the analyst and see where the invoice is in the process. And of course, this timeline assumes that the invoice is perfect, organized, everything has the proper backup documentation. Of course, if there's any issues and back and forth, that timeline may take a little bit longer.
Okay. Moving on, supporting documentation. So each invoice should have your invoice submittal summary sheet. Again, this is a template and we recommend you using it. It'll have the supporting receipts, so any costs that you're requesting to reimburse, you should be submitting the receipts that show that cost. And then you'll also have another template, which is the grantee labor certification form. This is where the grantee, so all the district folks and the teachers and admin folks that work at the district will be submitting their hours, their hourly rates. Again, you need to look at your budget, which is attachment 8A, to confirm who can reimburse their hours. The classifications are listed in the budget, and the max hourly rates are listed in the budget. You should not be submitting the max hourly rate that's listed in the budget, but the actuals that are for those classifications. We do not need your timesheets. However, you should be keeping track of timesheets if your project were to be audited, and you should be able to confirm the hours for those classifications. But we do not need your timesheets. By filling out the grantee labor certification form and being signed by the project director or the designee, that confirms the hours for those classifications for that quarter. You'll also be submitting a progress report for each invoice. If there's no progress report, we will not review the invoice. So there is a template. You will receive a progress report template. The progress report will basically list what work was done, and all the costs that's related for that quarter should be listed and explaining what was conducted in that quarter in the progress report. And then you would also be submitting other deliverables based on their deadlines if they're due that quarter. Some other highlights or reiterations are the receipts and invoices must be for the work completed in the reporting period and relates to the scope of the work in the agreement. So this is crucial. We always get costs that are outside the billing period. If for some reason you missed a cost or it was submitted at the end of the quarter and you were not able to submit it with that current quarter since you did not receive it from your subcontractors, it's something you should list in the summary sheet in the comments section to state that we have not reimbursed those costs before and the reason why it's late. If you submit any receipts or costs that are in the future billing period, we will tell you to remove and submit that in the next billing period. So most issues also arise in the labor certification form, and those are just miscalculations. So please make sure you're double checking all calculations and writing the correct numbers. We will have to submit a dispute if we see any miscalculations. Again, I urge all you guys to look at your budget 8A attachment to confirm what classifications are allowed to work on this project and what classifications you're allowed to request reimbursement for. If there's a classification you have missed and would like to add, I recommend you work with your grant manager to update your budget because we do verify your budget with your backups and your invoices to confirm who's allowed to get reimbursed by the State Water Board. And a reminder, we do not want your timesheets. Grantees should have them if audited for proof of the employee's hours, but we do not need your timesheets. And again, progress reports, make sure they're detailed enough to justify the invoices submitted for the reimbursement. And it should be clear enough for an auditor to read the progress report and understand the project status, work completed during that billing period. Basically, make it clear that it explains what costs are being reimbursed and what was conducted in that billing period. Lack of detail in the progress report can result in repayment of grant funds when grant is audited. Okay.
Moving on to our 2 invoice templates. You'll see the note up there. We need single-sided signed originals for each invoice. This first template is something that's mostly going to be pre-filled out. It's a new requirement we have from the State Controller's Office, this form. When you get it, at the top left, all of that information will be filled out. The to, from information will have your district-specific information. Excuse me. It will have your grant agreement number, the bottom information may or may not be filled out depending on the analyst. Some of them fill it out, some of them don't. But what's imperative here that you know is all we need on this form is for the middle box that is bold, that has reimbursement request amount. All we need from you on these is the reimbursement request amount, a signature, and a date. Everything else on this form will be filled out by the program analyst when they process the invoice through our new fiscal accounting system. So again, you'll get detailed instructions on how to do these forms when your grant is executed from the program analyst. So I don't want to spend too much time on this template. All you need to know is to fill out the invoice amount, sign, date, and submit. So moving on to the next template, this is a little bit more detailed template because it has your budget line items broken up. And again, all of this information will be filled out, your grant allotment amounts, the line items, the specific information related to your district, the purchase order number, grant agreement number, et cetera, et cetera. On these invoices, all you're going to have to fill out is the yellow highlighted boxes. So for every quarter, you're going to submit a progress report, that first invoice template that we went over, which we call a records reimbursement request form, and the secondary invoice, and the numbers should match. So the current expenditures column at the very bottom in bold should match what you've also included on the RR form, or the reimbursement request form. Again, you will get details and instructions on how to fill out this invoice template, but the main thing to remember is that your current expenditures would go in the middle item, and your previous expenditures to date need to be carried over from the previous quarter. So obviously your first invoice in the previous expenditures to date column will all read 0, and you'll just have current expenditures. But in the following invoice, all of the current expenditures from your first invoice will now be previous expenditures to date. And again, to reiterate, when we send out your executed agreement, that is when you'll receive all of these templates and instructions.
So the invoice summary sheet, this sheet will help organize all your backups and receipts and help us, so the grant manager and the program analyst, review your invoice. So on the very far left column it says item number, but I've written in red backup page numbers. So we recommend once you have all your backups for that quarter to either hand number all those pages or use a text box just to group up all the relevant costs for the items in each category. This helps us review and provide comments, if any. Mainly just helps us get through the invoice and get you your reimbursement quicker. So organization is key. This template that I've pre-filled out is an example of how you should be filling out your summary sheets. At the very top, I've written page 1 for an example, and then the XXX should be the relevant invoice number that your consultants or your accounting has labeled. It helps us find the correct sheet that we are reviewing. And then the date that's listed, the 6/30/19, which is the made-up date, but the date you will be writing is the date your receipt was received from your sub-consultant, so the accounting stamp number, or when the work was completed for that invoice. And then, for example, in the direct project admin costs, I have the labor certification form listed. And so that way I know I need to go to the labor certification form, and the total for that labor certification form is $500. But for the direct project admin section, you're only requesting $200 of those $500 costs. And then at the very far right, it just says comments. And in the comments, it says it's a labor rate for this billing period. So I will verify this by reviewing your budget, AA, make sure that the labor rate is, the hourly rate is under or meeting what's on the budget to assure that you are providing the correct hours, or we will need to update the budget accordingly if there was a raise and the budget does not reflect that. So as you can see, the comment section is also an important section where you would write if there was an receipt or an out of billing period cost that was supposed to be in the previous invoice, but for some reason it was turned late and you couldn't turn it around quick enough to meet that new period of submittal for the invoice. So that's where you would also write that this invoice receipt has not been paid before, and that it was received late from your subconsultants. So basically provide a justification and confirm that we have not paid this invoice before. And if you see the stuff that's highlighted in yellow, that stuff is the category subtotals. So those totals should match your invoice program sheet. The totals per category should all be matching. We usually get discrepancies here. Please make sure everything is matching. And again, this is supposed to help us review your backups. So if your backups are not organized or we are not able to follow it, we will submit a dispute. So you organize it and something that we can easily review and follow along. Okay, moving on to the labor certification. This is also a template which you'll receive, as Andrew mentioned, once your grant agreement is executed. This is where you would write all your in-house folks' hours and classifications, and by the person who's the project director or the designee signing off on this form is confirming the hours and rates worked in the billing period. Again, please make sure that you are only submitting hours for that billing period. If, as you can see, we have, for example, April 1st through June 30th. If you were to submit April 1st through July, we would tell you to remove the July costs and save that for the next quarter. Please make sure the billing period matches all the billing periods for all the sheets. And please make sure you're only submitting classification and rates that's listed in the budget. Again, if you have some classifications that are not listed in your budget, please work with your grant manager to update your budget and to make sure all the folks that are working at the district are getting reimbursed for their work that's related to our project. And then I just want to clarify what we allow in the hourly billing rate. So no indirect costs in the labor rates are allowed. Fringe costs such as benefits, vacation, sick, disability, etc. are eligible costs, but no indirect costs such as multipliers, building rentals, utilities should be in the hourly billing rate. So by the project director or the designee signing off on this form is confirming that those rates are not in there, and again, please make sure you're not billing us indirect costs. Okay, moving on. So the next slide, there's an example backup documentation. Here, what we look for is obviously we're going to look at the costs and make sure that they're directly related to our project. And then the other things that we look out for is the date. So we look out for the date that it was received by the district. And if the other date we can also allow is if the work was conducted in the billing period. So even if the district received it a month later, but the work was conducted in the current billing period, we will accept that. Those are something we make sure that the work is conducted within the billing period, and the costs that you're claiming are related directly to our project. And then I also just want to mention that sometimes that the entire backup and cost is not related to our project. You're allowed to write using text box or even handwrite, and just, circle what's directly related to us. If it's not clear, you can, add a total, add the few costs up, show us clearly that you're not asking reimbursement for the entire invoice, but you're just requesting reimbursement what's directly related to our project. And by doing that, it helps us review the invoice a little faster, and we don't have to send a dispute if something's not clear. Okay, moving on, here's another example of receipts. Again, dates. We're looking at dates on the receipts and the costs to make sure that they're directly related and within the billing period. And again, if the entire receipt is not related to our project, you can highlight, circle, write, use text boxes, basically make it clear what's related to our project and show us the total, and then we can confirm with the summary sheet that everything aligns and we don't have to send out a dispute if something doesn't make sense. So common invoice mistakes, lack of supporting documentation. Again, organization is key. Incorrect calculations on the invoice. We do have to submit disputes if you guys have miscalculated. So please double check your numbers. Incorrect rollover amounts from the previous invoice. We always get this mistake as well. Please make sure you guys are rolling over the correct totals. Ineligible tasks for reimbursement. Please make sure that you're only requesting things that are in our budget and directly related to our projects for reimbursement. inadequate progress reports or doesn't match the invoice. So please make sure your quarterly or monthly progress reports are relating to what was submitted for backups. If you're requesting $100,000 of reimbursement, make sure your progress reports explain what was worth $100,000 and what work was done, so it clearly makes sense to everyone, even auditors, if they were to review any of these invoices. Again, overhead and indirect charges are not allowed. So receipts that have indirect or overhead costs, you will just have to remove, and you could do that by hand or using text boxes. From your sub-consultants and contractors, they usually list overhead or indirect costs. Any arbitrary multiplier on the total, we do not reimburse. So the grantee will have to remove the indirect costs and from the reimbursement request and the backup sheets. Again, numbering the pages and indicating the page number on each item in the invoice summary helps us to review your invoices, and again, organization is key. Moving on, invoice disputes. So the grant manager will send via email. This stops the clock on the payment of the invoice, so this is why we don't guarantee a 45-day reimbursement. It depends on how clear your invoice is and how, if there's any disputes, or hoping there are no disputes. Again, the clock does not restart until revised invoice or documentation is received by the grant manager. So the dispute depends on the grantee and how quickly they respond to the comments. Lack of responsiveness on the grantee's part can result in a breach of agreement. So we hope that when you get the disputes that you are responding and submitting comments and changes back as quickly as possible. So progress reports, again, we need them every invoice, so that depends on if you're invoicing quarterly or monthly. Majority of you will be invoicing quarterly. So the progress report documents progression of the project. It supports the expenditures invoice that period, and then it's submitted monthly or quarterly with the invoice, so depending on what you have agreed to submit in your agreement. Majority of you, again, are going to be quarterly. And then it describes the work performed, accomplishments, any setbacks, and milestones that were occurred or accomplished in that billing period. So if the progress report is lacking detail or it's not matching the backups, we will submit a dispute. So you guys will need to update accordingly.
Moving on, we mentioned an auditable file earlier, and again, this is something that you're going to have to keep for a period of 7 years after the work completion date. And on the screen is a list of things that, it's not a complete list of the things that you would want to keep. So a copy of your application, the FAST app that you submitted to the Water Board, the Water Board's funding approval, whether that was an email or another method of approval. 95% of them were all emails, and you should have received that already if you're on this call. You would want to keep your resolution on file, any deviations, amendments, extensions, budget shifts, any significant correspondence, invoice disputes, invoices. You want to keep all of your backup documentation for all of the invoices, and copies of any deliverables, whether or not that's letters from the Division of State Architecture, emails from the technical contact saying that your POUs are good to go, You can keep these either electronically or as a hard copy. A lot of times we recommend you do both in case something happens to one or the other. And again, we require you to keep this for 7 years, and we also have an auditable file here on our end that we keep for 7 years. And all of this is in case of an audit. You want to be able to show the auditors exactly what happened in the project, how you're able to show that the costs being reimbursed are valid. And then if we move to the next slide, a few of the common auditable findings that we see either with our grantees or with us are unsupported expenditures, inadequate fiscal controls, which means you guys can't properly document or show X teachers worked Y hours on the project, lack of compliance, and a problem with deliverables. So unsupported expenditures usually tend to happen when contractors or consultant invoices aren't detailed enough. So you want to set a precedent early on with your subcontractors and the information that they're providing to you on their invoices. You want it as detailed as possible. Again, you're going to want to keep all of that for 7 years. We mentioned that we don't need timesheets, but if you are using them to track the hours people work on the project, then you would want to keep those in your file. And again, all of this can normally be avoided if you keep an open line of communication with the grant managers and the program analysts. If you have any questions about what you should keep, please contact either myself, one of the other program analysts, or the grant manager listed in your contract and ask questions.
So, common auditable findings with your subcontractors. So, excuse me. The same rules apply. Subcontractor invoices for work out of scope. So if you can, please avoid submitting a total invoice package. Just submit the relevant pages from your consultants. I know that most of you guys have like other district projects, but that's not related to our agreement. But you guys have one contractor, so if you can, avoid submitting us the entire package. This will help with our review and getting your reimbursement sooner. Subcontractor invoices for work outside terms of the grant. These, make sure you all know your work completion date. Any work after the work completion date will not be reimbursed. So please make sure that you guys are staying on schedule. Your grant managers will help make sure you guys are staying on schedule. Payments that exceed the contracted rate. Again, we will be comparing all your invoices with our budget, so you can't exceed what we have in the budget. If it does, that's cost that the district will have to pay from their pocket. So please make sure that you guys are reviewing your budget, which is attachment 8A. Lack of detail on subs and invoices. Wrong project name, multiple projects on one invoice, and lack of internal controls and measures. So we know that, again, you guys might have one contractor with multiple projects. Please just submit the relevant pages, and if you can't break up the entire invoice and they are combined together, please use text notes or hand notes, which clearly shows us which costs are related to our project. If you cannot have your sub-consultants split the projects beforehand. Again, organization is key, and if you have any questions, always ask your grant manager or your program analyst. We're here to help. So that completes our presentation. Is there any questions that we can answer?
Actually, I just wanted to clarify a couple things before we got into the questions. And that is, what do you do when you get your draft agreement? Some of you have already received them, but what you want to focus on is the Exhibit D is a map and a table for each school of the work that we expect to be done. And we have attempted to, be consistent with what you submitted in your application in the attachment 5A. However, in a lot of cases, we did not approve the full project because we had so many applications for well above the $9.5 million. We had to prioritize what we approved, and so please review what Exhibit D looks like. And if you think we made a mistake, now is the time to bring it to our attention. And also, in the budget, you want to go back to your attachment 8A and look at what, if you are requesting to be reimbursed for labor of your district and school staff, you want to go back and look and see if you're really going to implement the work using those same people. For example, you might have put superintendent under admin, but you're really going to use admin staff, or perhaps the M&O lead will really be doing most of the work and not the superintendent. So it's fine to revise the budget to reflect how you're going to implement the work. Another example is maybe you just put superintendent for admin, but now you really want a consultant. For example, if you had RCAC or self-help helping you with an application, and you really want them to help with this invoicing process, a consultant needs to be listed in that admin category. So at this draft review stage, it's the time you can make adjustments as long as they don't affect the total budget. We want to get things accurate now before the grant is executed. You're also allowed to adjust your budget. Let's say, you really overestimated the cost of construction and you didn't put enough hours in for another category. Now is the time to make those adjustments, because after the grant's executed, those shifts between line items will need our approval, and they will be limited to a 15% of the total budget. We won't be able to just make big shifts. So now is the time to really look at what you submitted in attachment 8A and double check that we got Exhibit D right. And then the other important thing is to really check the deliverable dates, because that's what we'll be expecting. And the good news is, for most of you that are just doing access improvements, so you're just replacing fountains or installing new fountains and filling stations, there are very few deliverables. We just expect photo documentation before, I think it says before, during, and after. And if your attachment 5A had all of the before pictures, you can just submit that, because if that's still the case, you've already given us those pictures. But we will expect photo documentation to show that what work was completed. And then some of you got some budget to do like a school assembly. That's not very common, but if you did, there's a deliverable related to that. Otherwise, the agreement really just says build what's in Exhibit D. So there's very few deliverables.